HAL, yeah baby, it's NES Works episode 120. Finally, a proper original title from HAL Labs. How has it taken this long? NES Works viewers of course need no introduction to HAL. They're a part of the essential fabric of the NES, a crucial link in its DNA, having been a mainstay of the platform since the console's start in America, and a key contributor all the way back to the early days of the Famicom. HAL, of course, got its start as a developer in 1981, selling games to the tiny Japanese audience that had actually imported VIC-20, Apple II, and Commodore 64 home computers from America. That was absolutely a niche market, but that very peculiar focus ultimately worked out for them. See, all of those computers ran on variants of the MOS Technology 6502 or 6510 processor. And when Nintendo decided to create its own home console, it also went with a variant of the 6502. A fairly common chipset in the West, but one rarely seen in Japan outside of those expensive import computers that didn't support Japanese-specific features like kanji or half-width character sets, and therefore only had limited utility for people working in the Japanese language. Since HAL had specialized in that imported tech, its top programmers, like Satoru Iwata, became instant assets for Nintendo, helping to bulk up its early home lineup, an especially essential contribution in the days before third-party licensing. HAL filled a crucial role as a sort of invisible, uncredited second-party developer for Nintendo, alongside Intelligent Systems and Hudson. Unlike Hudson though, HAL didn't seem to have much in the way of self-publishing ambitions on Famicom. Hudson had played an instrumental role in opening up the Famicom for third parties, publishing Lode Runner and Nuts and Milk under its own label, despite both bearing all the aesthetic hallmarks of early first-party Nintendo releases. Despite HAL's first contribution to the Famicom lineup arriving as early as February 1984 with Pinball, the company didn't make the leap into Famicom self-publishing until late 1987 with Air Fortress. In the US, that breakthrough came in late 1988 with Millipede, Joust, and Defender 2. And even then, those weren't original HAL creations. As you know, all three of those games were holdovers from a failed Nintendo-Atari collaboration, proofs of concept that HAL developed for Nintendo on spec to peddle to Atari back in the days when the prospect of an Atari-distributed US release of the Famicom might actually have made sense. Those ROMs sat on a shelf for 4 years until HAL finally shrugged and did it themselves. It's only now, 3.5 years after HAL programmed projects like Pinball and Golf shipped alongside the NES at its US launch, that HAL makes a proper foray into the American market by publishing its own original creation for NES under its own label. Better late than never? That's a matter of opinion, but the Adventures of Lolo does at least benefit from HAL having been allowed to take the time they needed to get things right. This is a great little puzzle game, boasting detailed graphics, a strong soundtrack, and excellent gameplay. Fundamentally, it amounts to little more than Soukoban putting on airs. But given that Americans had yet to actually see a proper Soukoban adaptation on any console as of April 1989, that's not really a bad thing. But that's weird to think about, right? As often as I've covered Soukoban here. But think back over the past decade of NES and Game Boy Works and Segaiden and so forth, and you'll find that all of the official and knockoff Soukoban titles to have appeared here to date either never made their way to the US, or else showed up further down the road, as with 1990's Boxel. It's another one of those weird localization quirks of the 8-bit era, similar to the way we still haven't seen the original Dragon Quest hit NES yet, with an assist from HAL incidentally, despite the number of numerous post-Dragon Quest Famicom works like Ultima Exodus, Zelda 2, and Simon's Quest that have appeared on NES. Anyway, that's bad news for anyone who decides to localize a straight adaptation of Soukoban into the US from this point on, because Adventures of Lolo absolutely demolishes the real thing. It does even more with the concept of pushing, never pulling boxes around the screen than even Legacy of the Wizard, which allowed you to break and zap blocks in addition to shoving them. In fact, I'd call Adventures of Lolo the best thing to happen to Soukoban until Sharon the Wanderer Games decided to create its puzzle dungeons that combined Soukoban with the workings of roguelikes. And personally, I'd give Adventures of Lolo the edge in terms of personality. I mean, look at this cute little guy. His games may have faded into obscurity, but he still puts in the odd appearance in that other HAL series about a cute little round guy. Anyway, you play as the aforementioned cute little guy, Lolo, who has to conquer 20 stages of puzzles in order to rescue his lady friend. This amounts to climbing a 10-floor tower in which each floor contains 5 puzzle rooms that you conquer in linear fashion. Each stage comes down to a matter of figuring out how to move some blocks around. That's it. But actually, that's not it. This is not simple Soukoban, where all you do is scooch boxes into predetermined spots. It doesn't matter precisely where you place boxes here or which boxes you place where. Your goals are not about placement, but rather about collection. The Soukoban elements exist entirely in service of a larger goal, which amounts to picking up all the items you need in order to open up the entrance to the next stage. Adventures of Lolo revolves around a few key elements, most notably red boxes called heart framers. Each stage has a set number of heart framers that you need to collect. Once you've gathered them all, a treasure chest containing a crystal materializes. Pick up the crystal and the stairs to the next room appears. Until that moment, however, Lolo is under constant threat. Every room of the tower is occupied by a variety of monsters that mostly pose a danger to Lolo's well-being. They can cause him harm with direct contact, zap him with deadly hit-scan energy beams, or simply trap him in a dead-end space and force him to waste a life restarting the level. The mix of monsters varies from level to level, but every stage more or less amounts to a delicate puzzle that forces you to think carefully about how you go about the task of collecting heart framers without exposing yourself to danger. The Soukoban element comes into play here as you make use of Lolo's ability to push, never pull, objects in order to protect himself from these creatures. The bulk of your box-pushing action revolves around green boxes called emerald framers, which you can move freely by pressing against them, until of course they run up against an obstacle, an enemy, or different terrain. Emerald framers are indestructible, impenetrable, and unpassable, functioning as barriers. Sometimes they are barriers to your own progress that need to be resolved, but often you can use them as barriers against the enemy's actions. And sometimes you need to put them to use as the latter, while taking care to avoid turning them into the former. Lolo needs to move emerald framers around each level to his own advantage, but those aren't the only interactive element you can manipulate. You also have the ability to turn a limited number of enemies into eggs in each stage. Presumably, the Japanese series Eggerland takes its name from this gameplay element, and you can push egged enemies around as if they were emerald framers. Actually, eggs are more dynamic than emerald framers. For example, not only can you use egg-bound monsters as barriers, you can also push them into the water to use as a bridge, or even as a raft. This ties in with a key factor that differentiates Adventures of Lolo from a standard Soukoban-type game. Its real-time mechanics. The monsters in Lolo's world often operate independently of your actions, roaming and attacking regardless of what you happen to be doing at any given moment. Some enemies are strictly reactive, of course. The deadly Don Medusa sits quietly in place, doing nothing until you cross its line of sight. Once that happens, though, it instantly sends beams of deadly energy your way. As soon as you enter a stage occupied by Don Medusae, you have to begin calculating how to work around their eye line. Likewise, the skull monsters sit harmlessly until you collect the last heart framer in a stage, at which point they spring to life and begin a relentless pursuit of Lolo. So that also becomes a factor. You have to plan your collecting activities around the proximity of heart framers and the crystal treasure box to the placement of skulls. In the more advanced levels, you can't simply set things in place and call it a day. You need to account for the dynamic nature of threats and plan a fluid, changing route through the stage. This adds an extra element of difficulty to the Soukoban format, but it also makes things more interesting. Adventures of Lolo never quite becomes a test of twitch skill or reflex, but it does demand the ability to think a few moves ahead and plan routes based on where enemies will be or how they may attack. Lolo does have a few additional skills working in his favor, though. You can collect tools like a hammer to break through rocks and create your own paths, and you can exploit the varied terrain of many stages to your advantage as well. Understanding the workings of grass, water, and sand proves invaluable for evading or confining enemy actions. The Adventures of Lolo has a steady difficulty curve that rises gracefully over the course of its 50 stages. There are no enormous difficulty spikes, no gotcha moments that will bring the game to a screeching halt. Each level builds on what's come before while introducing new factors or forcing you to consider how to use existing elements in new ways. It's one of the most polished and thoughtfully balanced games to have hit the NES to this point. But then, it should have been, by all rights. The Adventures of Lolo is not some newly forged creation invented from thin air by HAL. Technically, this game never actually shipped in Japan, making its worldwide debut in April 1989 on NES. But in reality, Adventures of Lolo had already shown up in Japan several times since the series' 1985 debut on MSX home computers as Eggerland Mystery. That game contained a whopping 105 stages, and its sequels, 1986's Eggerland Myth of the Labyrinth and 1988's Eggerland Revival of the Labyrinth, contained an additional 270 or so stages between them. The Adventures of Lolo takes the nearly 400 puzzle stages HAL had created to that point and pulls together 50 of them for this cartridge release. While those numbers would seem to suggest that NES owners were being shortchanged, those 50 stages represented the best puzzles from all of the previous games, a sort of greatest puzzle hits compilation thoughtfully arranged to lead new players from introduction to high-end challenge. The result is a brilliant, innovative, entertaining take on the Soukoban concept. Adventures of Lolo demands that players learn to observe, to plan an optimal path through each scenario, to manage space and movement, and to pull off their schemes once the action kicks into motion. The game doesn't operate with a timer, and most levels tend to be pretty freeform. Although you definitely want to perform certain actions and place objects in specific places in each stage, Adventures of Lolo manages to avoid leaving you with the sensation that you're reverse engineering the one rigid step-by-step solution that the puzzle designer expects you to follow to a T. After years of my writing about tedious Soukoban adaptations, I have to say that Adventures of Lolo feels like a breath of fresh air. And NES fans clearly agreed, since it ended up getting 2 sequels and a Game Boy adaptation. It took a while for HAL to finally express itself on NES, but the wait paid off. Disappointingly, Nintendo Power didn't have much to say about the Adventures of Lolo. The game got a half-page Pack-Watch preview in the May-June 1989 issue, and that's it, outside of the inevitable Counselor's Corner tips. You'd think that Nintendo could drum up a little more enthusiasm for a game by a developer it owed as much to as HAL, but that's gratitude for you. Next time on NES Works, the honeymoon's over and it's time for the good games to once again give way to the bad.